Good evening, everyone. We'll start now. Welcome. My name is Jan Brazier, and I'm the Curator History Macleay Collections here at the Chau Chak Wing Museum. I'm going to briefly introduce the talk and the speakers. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nations, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. The exhibition I've curated here for the opening of the museum is titled The Business of Photography, Business of Photography, the 19th Century Studio, with a focus on New South Wales. The exhibition draws on the historic photograph collection, part of the Macleay collections here, and the exhibition can be found on level 1. One of the photographers featured is JW Newland, whose daguerreotype portrait is the subject of tonight's talk by Elisa deCourcy and Martyn Jolly. I'm absolutely delighted that they're able to present this talk because they've recently published a book on Newland, as you'll find by the little cards on your seat, titled Empire, Early Photography and Spectacle, The Global Career of Showman Daguerreotypist JW Newland, published by Routledge. The format for tonight is that Elisa and Martyn will talk on Newland for about 35 minutes or so. Then they will be joined by Donna Brett for a discussion connecting the Newland image to the intricate local, imperial and global visual economies in which it was embedded. Before handing over though, I'll introduce our 3 speakers. Dr Elisa deCourcy is an art historian with a broad interest in the use and development of visual technologies in the 19th and early 20th centuries. She is an ARC DECRA Fellow with the project Capturing Foundational Australian Photography in a Globalising World, based at ANU. Dr Martyn Jolly is an Honorary Associate Professor at the ANU, with a background in photographic practice as well as photographic history and theory. He has developed theoretical and practice-led research into the impacts of digital media on photography curating, Australian photo books and magazines, magic lantern technology in Australia and the world, and contemporary reenactment strategies, amongst other topics. Dr Donna West Brett is Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Art History here at the University of Sydney and leader of the Photographic Cultures Research Group. Her current research projects focus on German photography and British disaster photography. I'll hand over now to Martyn and Elisa.
Thanks very much, Jan. So we're going to start with, first of all, an image. This is the image here. If you go downstairs, you'll see it at the entrance to Jan's wonderful show. And you might need to move your head back and forth a little bit for the image to become visible. But if you move your head in the right direction, this guy will suddenly appear before you. And his personality for us has always strongly twinkled through the daguerreotype process. So who was he? Who is he? Turns out he was your archetypal prominent Sydney identity. His name was Edward Thomas Young Wilson McDonald. He was actually born in Sydney. He was about 38 when this photograph was taken. He was married to a wife called Agnes, who was the stepdaughter of a business partner, and he had 4 kids. And he was a bit of a kind of business person, jack of all trades. He'd already owned 4 pubs. And at this stage, he'd owned ran a pub in the Rocks called the Forth Clyde on the corner of Cumberland Street and Essex Lane. And he also had property in Balmain. And a few months after this portrait was taken, 94 electors from his local council ward called Gips, which covered the Rocks area, nominated him as a person of sound practical sense and sterling abilities to be voted for as an alderman on the city council. And there was a tongue-in-cheek quality to this nomination of McDonald to stand for alderman. The nominee said in the paper, "In the event of your acceding to our request, we are determined that the system which has hitherto been recognised by candidates for civic honours of gaining supporters to their cause by the demoralising practice of spending large sums in public houses shall, in this instance, we trust and for all occasions, be entirely discountenanced. We also determined that in the future, our representatives shall be men of integrity of purpose, truckling to no clique. They keep in view the welfare of the citizens at large. So there's a bit of a kind of an in-joke in the way that this guy is being nominated. But he stood on a platform of better drainage, a larger and cheaper water supply, and better watering of the dusty roads, and improvements to the notorious alleyways around his pub that he ran in the rocks. He said from the platform, in a climate such as ours, with the dust-making streets of the city, the water supply should, if possible, be unlimited, and that supply at the lowest rate. Absolute need for us to mend our ways is no figure of speech. In Gipsward, let Brown Bear Lane, and that was a lane just to the down the hill from his pub, the corner of Harrington Street and Essex Street, and a number of other receptacles of all that is offensive and likely to produce malaria, bear witness. So he's kind of going to campaign on improving around his pub. In fact, if you go towards the MCA today, you can see a mural of Brown Bear Lane painted on the wall as you walk under the railway bridge towards the MCA. So despite these stirring words, McDonald was in fact an outsider candidate. The other candidate, called Honest Tom Agars, who owned a wharf at Darling Harbour, where Barangaroo now stands, had the major support of the press. When the two rivals, McDonald and Agars, attended the mayoral ball, one newspaper even satirically reported that McDonald, quote, was taken seriously ill during the evening of a complaint near the brain, which the doctors call impudent ignorance, brought on by an overexertion in canvassing the ward. His medical advisor states that the complaint will totally disappear as soon as the election has been decided. But McDonald didn't disappear, as the newspapers had anticipated. Instead, he beat Agars, 204 votes to 150. Apparently, there was only 300 and so voters in that particular ward. There were mutterings in the press. Quote, beaten candidates complained most bitterly of the conduct of those who, after requesting them to come forward and promising their support, voted against them. Insofar as bribery and treating it were concerned, we feel satisfied that more money was lavished in this trumpet ward affair than was expended by all the candidates put together at the late general election for the Legislative Council. But despite these rumours of bribery, McDonald held his seat on the council for a 3-year term. So for us, these qualities that we've found in the newspapers of easy confidence, tempered with whispers of a little light bribery, still come through his daguerreotype portrait even today. The man spreads his legs confidently toward us, resting one ungloved hand easily on his thigh. His elbows rest on the cloth-covered side table, which was a standard feature of the studio furniture, as the other gloved hand pivots the handle of his cane in a very kind of easy, sort of assertive gesture. In his cravat, waistcoat and jacket and topper, it's easy to imagine him still holding court in one of his pubs, charming his 94 mates with his sterling abilities, insistently showing off his ignorant impudence at the mayoral ball, and finally getting the council to improve the drains around his property asset.
But the picture of McDonald is more than just an image. It's also an object. It's a case daguerreotype. The unique image was exposed for about 30 seconds onto a copper plate, coated with polished silver, and then sensitized with silver iodine. The resulting portrait was placed in an elaborately embossed Morocco-covered wooden case, then preserved by gilt mat before being covered with a sheet of glass. The lid was padded with plush velvet and decorated with a floral motif. The whole thing cost McDonald a guinea, about the equivalent of 5 days' pay for a tradesman. There's no negative and positive in the daguerreotype process. This is the very plate which was placed in the camera in the Sydney studio, and the same one developed, cased, and passed on to McDonald to carry home. There's a blind stamp just visible in the lower right-hand corner of the gilt mat, although it is reversed. We've just flipped it back for you. And if we turn it upside down, we can make out the name of the studio, Newlands. This image object is therefore a material trace to an experience of the early photography studio, brokered by one daguerreotypist, JW Newland. Yet its component parts, much like its photographer, came from elsewhere. Who was he? James William Newland was born in 1810 in Suffolk, England, in about the same year that McDonald was born in Sydney, Australia. The first trace of Newland is in a baptismal record in 1815, where his mother is recorded as Eliza Newland, and his paternity is left curiously blank. I say curiously because you can see that something's been scratched out in the column that lists his mother and his last name as well. Little is known about his early life. Newland sailed for the United States in the late 1830s, before photography was invented, working as a merchant in Texas. He next appears in New Orleans in May 1845 at the intersection of Royal and Canal Streets, where presumably, after some instruction, he was operating his own studio as a commercial daguerreotypist. There was a Daguerrean studio on each corner of this intersection, 3 businesses besides from Newlands, with proprietors that were perpetually locked in colourful and voracious battles in the press for custom and prestige. Each studio operated under a dual business model, much like notable East Coast daguerreotype studios, which you may have heard of Matthew Brady and John Plum. They incorporated spaces to have your daguerreotype portrait taken and rooms for exhibition, Daguerrean galleries. Newland does not last more than 3 months on this crowded street corner, but before he leaves New Orleans, he stocks up on cases, plates, and materials, including that which would house McDonald's image 3 years later in Sydney. He sets out not just in search of customers, but embarks on constructing a Daguerrean gallery, which would eventually far surpass those of his New Orleans competitors. From July 1845, Newland travelled down through Central and South America, across the Pacific to Tahiti, and on to New Zealand before arriving in Sydney Cove in February 1848. He was hopping on and off trade vessels at British and international ports along his route. At most of his stops, which you can see on this map, he was an early ambassador for photography, if not the first commercial daguerreotypist to arrive. He swept through busy port cities, targeting places like the hinterland city of Arequipa in Peru that had sizable middle-class populations. He was traveling in vessels laden with raw commodities and steamers devoted to carrying news and mail. In places like Valparaiso in Chile in July 1847, we get a sense of Newland's mounting plan, the body of accruing exposed plates that he is carrying. The newspaper El Mariquio advertises that he is at the American Hotel, in Spanish, selling some of his superfluous camera equipment, taking commissions for daguerreotype portraits, and showing what was called views or outdoor images from his prior stops, including views from Arequipa and the port at Callao. Newland left South America in September 1847, beginning a journey across the Pacific that would pause in Tahiti at the end of the year. Tahiti was key to the collection of daguerreotypes Newland was gathering because it afforded him the opportunity to take a portrait of Queen Pomare, who was very familiar to the people of New South Wales, that were aghast when they read newspaper reports of the French coup, which had some years earlier seized her throne and power. In January 1848, Newland had spent over a month in Tahiti, during which time he'd been making daguerreotypes of the royal family and several elites. By comparison, his ship only stopped briefly in the Cook Islands, where he would make daguerreotypes of people he would later describe as Fijians, and spent only a few days at the Bay of Islands in New Zealand. But by the time Newland arrived in Sydney, a month later, he was carrying an extensive luggage of exposed daguerreotype plates, which he would hang in the rooms he rented above the store of the prominent Sydney businessman, Henry Fisher. The daguerreotypes represent the first substantive exhibition of photography in the Australian colonies. The careful wording of his advertisements in the Sydney papers resonated with a consciousness of the broader visual economy to which his images belonged. Keen to capitalise on the mounting curiosity for her likeness, Newland boasted holding the only correct picture ever taken of Queen Pomare. He described the New Zealand portraits in his gallery as merely beautiful specimens, quote, covering for the absence of chiefs and high-status subjects. Newland worked quickly to paper over the omission of individual celebrities, other than those of the royal family of Tahiti, by emphasising the extensive arc of his own trajectory, documented by daguerreotypes, the total which made up a panorama from Grenada right across the Pacific. In some, upwards of 200. Amongst them may be seen, as his ads say, the only correct picture of Queen Pomare, the king, the royal family, chiefs, several beautiful specimens of New Zealanders, Fijians, Peruvians, Chileans, Grenadans, and panoramic views of the city of Arequipa, Peru, and Co. The panoramic was a powerful visual trope during this period when most colonial audiences were familiar with actual panoramas, showing events from near and far. For instance, just before Newland had arrived in Sydney, the Sydney scene painter, George Roberts, painted a grand panorama illustrating the principal events in the glorious career of the immortal naval hero, Lord Nelson. It unrolled before the eyes of the audience at the Royal Victoria Theatre, bringing the animated theatre of European battlegrounds alive for Sydney audiences. Yet Newland's Daguerrean Gallery was not simply a European import. In its design, Newland's gallery was probably much like the daguerreotype galleries of Brady, Plum, or Edward Anthony, and those of his immediate erstwhile competitors at Canal Street, New Orleans. It was an adjoining room to a studio space in which prospective clients could preview examples of his work. Yet in terms of its global reach and its content, it was unmatched. Newland's Daguerrean Gallery was uniquely drawn from across the British Caribbean, the ex-Spanish colonial empires of the Americas, the British and French colonial domains, and the British and French colonial domains of the Pacific. It is hard to overstate the significance of the gallery's first showing in Sydney, with faces drawn from across 3 diminishing and descendant empires and numerous free states. It did not comprise of examples reinforcing nationalistic stability or Republican respectability, as Brady's New York gallery had, but was a panorama of both exotic and familiar scenes and faces caught up in the tumult of political instability. McDonald would have seen this gallery before sitting for his own portrait. He perhaps aspired to have a second exposure of his own image hung among its cast of faces. Through the likenesses and views in the Daguerrean Gallery, Australian colonists could directly assess their broader Antipodean world to which they were now a part. One visitor to the gallery noted in a review, "The enterprising artist has visited South America and presented us not only with charismatic portraits of its native inhabitants, but landscapes of considerable beauty in the city of Lima and the port of Callao. Thence the traveller proceeded to the South Islands, and in verisimilitude of sorrow scarcely to be mistaken, we see a portrait of the island Queen Pomare in the midst of her suffering, her husband, her relatives, her friends, her counsellors, her different classes of subjects, depicted with faithfulness that cannot be disputed, doing more in our minds to establish this history of the last few years in Tahiti than the asseverations of a dozen lecturers or a score of erratic travellers. There is at least civilization, perhaps in this rough-hewn state, has cast its mantle on the people, and we recognize the portraiture before us as it has belonged to the precincts of the acknowledged civilized world. The European portraits are very good, generally a substantive appearance, very much in advance of the shadowy prototypes first presented to the public. 2 weeks later, a reporter for the Sydney Chronicle also paid a visit. In joining the admiration for the gallery, he tested the optical perfection of the daguerreotype against his own assumptions derived from prints and illustrated books and newspapers he may have seen. For this particular reporter, the verisimilitude of the daguerreotype was revelatory, allowing him to substantially compare and calibrate features within each portrait. He writes, "This collection embraces several of a series of most splendidly executed sketches of South America and Polynesian scenery, a large number of excellent portraits, including those of Queen Pomare and the royal family of Tahiti. Her Tahitian Majesty has an older appearance than we are expected to have seen, but her features, although decidedly of the Malay caste, are, upon the whole, rather commanding. The Prince Consort, however, appears to be several years younger than his royal spouse, and it is certainly a very fine-looking man with a more European style of countenance than is commonly found among the natives of the Polynesian islands." Newland's Daguerrean Gallery was a direct product of his westward trajectory and the possibilities this route afforded him for taking portraits. It entered Sydney and travelled onward with him as an unprecedented experience of verisimilitude in portraits and views made across the southern hemispheric world. He even incorporated a self-portrait, which one reviewer commented on in an article entitled "Painted with Sunbeams" as the most striking portrait exhibited. Its inclusion demonstrates Newland's self-presentation as an impresario and his desire to emphasize the uncanny resemblance between fixed daguerreotype and living subject.
So Newland's studio in this amazing gallery was situated was right in the heart of Sydney, in the northeastern corner of George and King Street. And it's precisely at this intersection that the reader of a book called Sydney in 1848, a publication produced to promote the city, was invited to place themselves to experience Sydney as a city. Quote, "The handsome equipages that dash past, the elegantly clad females, the stylish groups of gentlemen point out the seat of amusement and gaiety. The heavily laden wains, the crowds that sweep past in every direction, the hasty step of some, the thoughtful brow of others, betokening the purpose of intense occupation, all speak of extensive trade and untiring commercial activity." The streets around Newland's studio were lit by gas from a coal gas generator on Darling Harbour. The block to the southeast of his studio, which is now Pitt Street Mall, was described as one of the most remarkable localities of Sydney. It was a London in miniature. Quote, "Particularly in the evening when the theatre is open, amongst a blaze of gas from the splendid and glittering shops, the music and bustle attending the movement of a crowd bent on its evening amusement, and those of the multitude still busied in closing the avocations of the day, the new arrival from London may recognise the most striking features of that great city, united in the varied scene around him. On a diminutive scale, it is true, as compared to those of the metropolis of the world, but nonetheless, the identical features in miniature." We can tell from this portrait that we've just discussed that the newspaper characterizations of McDonald, and perhaps even that he and perhaps even his wife and children were the kind of people who would have enjoyed all of the delights of this varied scene. For instance, in just 1 week in late April 1848, they had the following entertainments to choose from. Thomas Clancy had on exhibition a beautiful Royal Bengal tigress, viewable for a shilling or 6pence for children. The parents of a 10-month-old child with a congenital malformation that gave its skin the colour of tan leather and a covering of thick brown hair, were exhibiting the child as a wonderful phenomenon in the Fitzroy Cafe house. For a shilling, children half price. Or for more refined entertainment, you could hear the singer F.W. Horncastle at the School of Arts. And if McDonald had wanted to delight his children at home, he would have even have purchased fireworks from the future Father of Federation, Henry Parkes. Then suddenly, during that same late April week, an entirely novel attraction joined these fantastic attractions that were already there. The daguerreotypist JW Newland mounted a beautiful scientific exhibition of dissolving views at Sydney's largest theatre, the Royal Victoria Theatre, located right in the heart of the gaslit theatre entertainment district. So how did Newland, who, as we have heard, just arrived in Sydney from New Zealand and the Pacific, get what he describes as an apparatus of the most splendid and costly description to mount his exhibition? As Newland's advertisement reminds us, and reminds its readers, with the phrase, as shown at the Royal Polytechnic Adelaide Gallery, from the mid-1830s, London institutions such as the Royal Polytechnic and the Adelaide Gallery incorporated magic lantern shows into their programs. Their lanterns were powered by the new limelight, sometimes known as Drummond light, which produced a powerful white light by heating a block of calcium oxide with oxyhydrogen flames. They further developed the apparatus for dissolving views, by which one hand-painted glass transparency slide was slowly dissolved into another using two lanterns. The Polytechnic also developed the chromatrope, a kaleidoscopic effect of pulsating colour produced by rotating two patterned glass discs in opposite directions using pulleys. To complete these shows, actual insects were directly projected onto the screen by an oxyhydrogen microscope, an optical arrangement attached to the front of the lanterns. Newland had become aware of the potential of magic lantern shows during his time in the US. The entertainment circuits had also begun to feature magic lanterns and gas lighting. In New Orleans also, blackface minstrelsy was also emerging as a dominant modern form of theatre, with groups of white musicians gaining enormous popularity by parodying African Americans. It was probably in New Orleans that Newland met and teamed up with the actor J.P. Hydes, who was, like him, originally from England. About the same time as Newland was developing his daguerreotype practice in New Orleans, as we've just heard from Elisa, J.P. Hydes may also have been developing a blackface Congo minstrel act, adopting all of the conventions such as bone castanets, which were becoming popular in American theatres of the time. Perhaps just before leaving New Orleans, or perhaps somewhere on their travel through the Caribbean, Newland and Hyde sent an order, probably through the British bi-monthly steam packet service, to an optician at the Royal Polytechnic Institution in London. In April 1847, while Newland was taking daguerreotypes in Peru, as we've just heard, two magic lanterns, a collection of dissolving view slides, and an oxyhydrogen microscope were packaged up in London and loaded onto a vessel bound for Sydney. The box was addressed to both JW Newland and JP Hydes and joined 114 other parcels on the ship bound for the Australian colonies. The contents of the other parcels range from pianos to surgical instruments to satins and silks to Holloway pills. The box arrived in Sydney in September 1847. Over the same time, Newland had just travelled between Peru and Chile. So while Newland and Hydes traversed the Pacific aboard a trading vessel, the box waited for them in a King Street warehouse of the shipping agents Armitage & Co. Waited for them for close to 5 months before they caught up with it. Once he unpacked the box, Newland taught himself how to generate oxygen gas and store it into a rubber bag to be mixed with a jet of coal gas from the Darling Harbour plant to heat a block of calcium oxide and operate the first limelight apparatus in the Australian colonies. He must have also taught himself how to operate the dissolving view magic lanterns and the oxygen and hydrogen microscope. So alongside these performances, Newland continued to attend to his Daguerrean studio and gallery by day. He then arranged to have another run of his beautiful scientific exhibition over the 3 evenings in June at the lecture hall of the Sydney Mechanics Institute. Okay, I just skipped forward a bit there. Okay, so although Newlands illuminated scenery with a sequence of dissolving projections, he borrowed a unit of measurement, 10,000 square feet, that's familiar to readers from hand-painted moving panoramas on canvas, which, as we've already discussed, was also begun to be exhibited at the Royal Victoria Theatre. Newlands Show therefore built on the established spectacle of the moving panorama with the dissolving view apparatus, but also included J.P. Hyde's and his Congo Minstrel Act from New Orleans. The Newlands Sydney novelty therefore combined two of the latest developments in international entertainment: Magic Lantern Show, developed in Britain, and blackface minstrelsy, developed in the United States. Both provided colonial audiences with direct access to a cosmopolitan modernity, and both would have profound impacts on the subsequent development of popular culture. Colonial theatre audiences were drunk, rowdy, and combative. Newland had initially set up his apparatus in the pit of the Royal Victoria Theatre, but during his second performance, some person maliciously injured the apparatus, so he shifted it onto the stage, thus preventing any further alarm. As well as dangerous, Sydney audiences were very socially stratified. Newland's dissolving view performances, prices started at 3 shillings and 6pence for a dress circle, more than 3 times the price of admission to the Bengal Tiger, and went down to 6pence for the gallery and the pit. Newland divided his show into 3 parts, accompanied by music from the theatre's in-house orchestra, which also provided the music for their moving panoramas and pantomimes. Not unlike a painted moving panorama, that dissolves from one image into another, transported the audience on a journey back through the space and time to the old world. Newlands shows climaxed with 2 slides of the famous East India Company ship the Kent, which had burned spectacularly in the Bay of Biscay in 1825 and had become the subject of many marine paintings. First of these slides, which Newland projected in the theatre, showed his audience the Kent struggling in a gale which everyone knew had split apart a cast of spirits amongst its cargo and knocked over a candle. That slide then slowly dissolved into the second slide, which showed the ship on fire, probably much like this one here. A fire which everyone knew had been started by the candle igniting the spirits. So alongside these performances, Newland continued to attend to his Daguerrean studio and gallery by day. He then arranged to have another run of his beautiful scientific exhibition over the 3 evenings in June at the lecture hall of the Sydney Mechanics Institute, also in Pitt Street. The School of Arts was modelled on a similar institution for intellectual improvement in Britain. It was already equipped with a collection of fossils and geological specimens, a 3,000-volume library, a reading room with overseas periodicals, and for lectures and classes, a theatre, which has a complete oil-lit magic lantern apparatus for lectures. This small lecture theatre which Newland used was far less grand than the Royal Victoria Theatre. And without the support of the manager of the Royal Victoria Theatre, Newland even remained unaware that he had to apply for a licence to perform from the Colonial Secretary in order to accept money at the door. He didn't fill out the right form. When he hastily applied for a licence for exhibiting the dissolving views, he apologised. "I am desirous to make my first exhibition this evening, and it's only this present day that I was aware the licence was necessary, where I would have applied before." Not having any personal knowledge of the applicant, the Colonial Secretary demanded testimonials from some known respectable persons, that Newland was a proper person to obtain a licence. The Secretary of the School of Arts, the poet and painter and lecturer Samuel Prout Hill, vouched for Newland. He was a gentleman and well known to him, and so the exhibitions went ahead. He got the paperwork done. In the scientific surroundings of the School of Arts, Newland made one innovative addition to his previous theatre program. At the conclusion of the exhibition, the room was brilliantly illuminated by heating a block of naked calcium oxide, so it lit the whole room up with pure white light. By July, Newland was running out of customers in Sydney for his studio, his Daguerrean Gallery, and his dissolving view exhibitions. Colony was still slowly hauling itself out of the depression of the early 1840s. The whaling industry was declining, and many colonists were heading to the Californian goldfields. Newland's landlord, Henry Fisher, advertised that the suite of apartments formerly occupied by Newland was now to let for immediate possession. The location offered, he said, a fortune for the artist, rather hopefully. But without his fortune made, Newland headed north to Maitland in the Hunter Valley, then south to Van Diemen's Land, and finally to Calcutta, on board a ship exporting Tasmanian horses to India.
Edward McDonald was born and raised in Sydney. His world centred on the streets of Sydney, from Balmain to the edge of the rocks, where he had his hotel, down to the central entertainment precinct. As we have shown you tonight, there is plenty going on in this pocket of colonial space. We know from looking at his portrait that McDonald was up for anything, and so he certainly would have been fully engaged with these rapidly evolving spaces of colonial modernity. However, when McDonald made the decision to spend a guinea at Newland's studio, and when he most certainly viewed Newland's Daguerrean Gallery, and when he perhaps spent 3 shillings 6pence on a box for his family at one of Newland's dissolving view exhibitions, he found his Sydney world directly connected to larger global networks. These networks, as we have demonstrated, were forged by trading ships circuiting across the Pacific and extended up to North America on one side of the globe, up to the UK on the other, with mail steamers shuttling between them. They were material networks, carrying, for instance, the component parts of the case in which McDonald's portrait was mounted, and experiential networks bringing novel sights and sounds. Unlike McDonald, Newland's life played out on this much larger global scale, and his practice as a daguerreotypist cum showman accrued alongside his travels. Yet despite his far-flung travels, he keenly felt the need to mould his business to the desire of colonial customers and audiences like McDonald. He brought to Sydney an experience of photography and early popular visual culture that both incorporated and extended beyond the British imperial world. As you walk through the business of photography downstairs, you'll see that this is a precedent emulated in various ways by those photographers and showmen who came after him. Australian photography has always been a media experienced alongside other visual attractions, and one made, sent, and exhibited through a wider global consciousness.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. So much information there. And of course, the book, which I hope you've all got your little brochures here. Bye-bye. This is a great pleasure for me because Elisa and Martyn asked me to write a little something about their book for the little blurb for the back of it. But more than that, I actually know Martyn from a long time ago. He was my teacher at art school for 6 months, wasn't it?
Best 6 months of my life.
Oh, yeah. We remember it vividly. So it's a fantastic opportunity and welcome to everyone. So I've got loads of scribbles here. I was wondering, Elisa, if you could talk about Newlands Studio here in relation to the plethora of studios that were going on at the time. In particular, I think he was around the same time or perhaps a little bit before Goodman's studio and after Gleister and Freeman Brothers. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the relationship of that kind of era and those studios, because they were popping up everywhere, weren't they?
Yeah, sure. I hope you can hear me. So as we kind of intimated in our talk, Newland's important for Australian photography in a number of ways. His Daguerrean Gallery, which we kind of gave you a bit of a glimpse at, is significant because it's it definitely has a kind of racial fetishization element, which is unsavory for us to, think about in today's kind of current context. But it's before this ethnographic moment in which photography gets completely embroiled. So he's bringing an experience of images, faces, which are second exposures of paying customers. So people he's encountered with on his trip so far. But it is definitely very cosmopolitan. Goodman, who's commonly recognised as the first commercial photographer in the Australian colonies, arrives in 1842 in Sydney. So this is 6 years before Newland. And Goodman actually erects a photography studio made out of blue glass on top of the Royal Victoria Hotel, which is a kind of phenomenal spectacle to photography as an experience. You know, you couldn't miss it. But it's also a very bracing experience of having your portrait taken. He arrives in December and, you know, I mean, I don't need to preach to you, Sydney in December in the middle of summer, sitting in a glass house to take your portrait is a very hot and horrendous activity, especially because taking a daguerreotype, as we said, is a process where you need to sit perfectly still for about 30 seconds. So people like Goodman bring an imported experience of photography in terms of the architecture of the studio and in terms of the kind of product that they're peddling, the experience they're peddling is very much from Britain, from London. What Newland does 6 years later is bring a much more cosmopolitan experience, which is typified in the fact that he has this Daguerrean Gallery of faces from the Southern Hemispheric world. But he's got cases and materials, and he's trained in an American space that doesn't require the architecture of the glass house, and he uses reflectors to kind of direct light onto the seated subject in a kind of well-lit room, but not on the top of a building. And I think what we see after Newland in people like Glaister, who you mentioned, Donna, is that, you know, colonial customers and colonial audiences are really keen for choice. So people like Glaister, whose studios open in the mid-50s, advertise that you can have kind of French cases, or you can have American cases for your daguerreotype, or you can have British cases. There's heaps of different choices. His customers, he gives them instructions on how to dress. So it's very much, it becomes a kind of cosmopolitan experience after someone like Newland arrives. And that idea of the photographic world and the photographic experience is not just an import from Britain or from France, but something a lot more global in nature.
Thanks. You're painting a really interesting picture. And thinking about cosmopolitanisms, which you brought up, I was really interested in the book, but also in your talk, about the wonderful phenomena and attractions, Martyn, which you made sound quite lively, actually. And in the book, you connect his transmedia approach to photography through physical experiences of the daguerreotype, but also the magic lantern, as spectacle, as entertainment, and connecting it also to our current networked world. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the relationship of photography to the large visual economy of spectacle within this colonial modernity.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a issue that starts, I think, with our standard disciplinary silos that we're in. Say, art history needs an artifact to do its art history on. But if you jump out of those silos and you think about somebody walking down George Street in 1848 with a guinea in their hand, and what am I going to spend it on?
Which was a lot of money, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, it's about 4 days, 5 days page. But some money, I could go and see a mutant baby, you know, it could be a good investment for a shilling, or I could go to a Daguerrean Gallery. And the Daguerrean Gallery has been lost, so all those amazing photos that we described of Pomare disappeared. But if you think about the experience of which photography was a part, you get, I think, a much deeper and richer understanding of photography itself, how it functioned. And certainly, it was about the family, it was about identity, but it was also about, as we say, where do I sit within the Southern Hemisphere? I'm on the edge of the empire. You know, where am I? So you could use the daguerreotype to perform that kind of labour. So for us, it's been really great to get out of our normal silos about the object. And although we'd love to have those daguerreotypes come back to us out of the past, the fact that they're not here, you know, sort of allows us to kind of, you know, imagine the kind of space, and that was a network space. So the blackface minstrelsy, for instance, which is incredibly racist, but it was the very latest from America, and we now want to hear the latest from America, and that's what Newland provided. So it reacts to our own sense of our own immersion in these global networks.
Yeah, and it kind of gives us a sense of that exchange, doesn't it, between different countries, but also he enacted that exchange through his own travels and bringing those ideas with him, I suppose.
Yeah. We were kind of conscious when we were writing the book that most imperial histories are centripetal, if that's the right word. So it's about London, you know, the frontier, back to London again, or New York, the frontier, back to London. So it's going out those spokes. And what Newland allowed us to do was to think about other centrifugal trajectories that are driven by the same kind of forces, but they're driven at a different torque. And Newland was, in a way, he was very unlucky, but for us he was very lucky because he left Australia before the gold rushes. And he left America way before the American Civil War, but the Texan War was on. So he wasn't attracted until he got to Calcutta to any major imperial centre. So he was kind of pinged around a bit, which for our purpose was really handy.
Yeah. Lucky you. That's right. And I'm also interested, of course, in thinking about the research that you did, thinking about particularly following this guy around the world, you know, from one location to another, which you almost did kind of in your research. And in the book, you talk about the types of research that you undertook, which I think, talk about brave. And we were just downstairs talking about archives and the fact that, you know, we can't get into any of them at the moment. So can you talk about, you know, you talked about shipping records and maps, what Renders calls micro-histories of biography. And I'm wondering if you could tell the audience a little bit about how you actually managed to get this material together, given the challenges of this obscure fellow.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. The short answer to it is a lot of emailing, but the longer answer is, I guess it's kind of the cliche of historian as detective, and you step back from your disciplinary orientation of an image or an image archive, and you think, when you're a biographer, which this book is loosely biography, in the sense that we're using biography to write photo history. So and of course we had the other complexity that Newland actually moves across so many different language spaces. So, you know, he's communing in Spanish, we've got French in Tahiti, English, British, and there's Maori. Okay, all right. Is that better? All right, I won't move. Oh. So, it's okay. So we visited a lot of archives. Maybe I could just use Donna's microphone.
Am I too close to you?
Okay. Right.
It's my fault.
We did a lot of traveling, and we visited a lot of archives in North America and in the UK. We have a particularly memorable story of going to Hobart. Newland's responsible for the first outdoor picture of Australia, and we kind of never really understood how it was made until we went to Hobart, and the buildings in Hobart are still the same as they were in 1848, which is actually very helpful when you're doing this kind of work. And we found the building, the Stones building where his studio was, and his actual floor, I think it's all right to tell this story, his actual floor was for let with a real estate agent, and we didn't do anything really wrong, but we just pretended that we were interested in letting this particular room that his studio was in, because we wanted to see how he took the picture out the window. And we realized, Martyn realized, credit Martyn, when I was talking to the real estate agent pretending to be interested in the kitchen plumbing, that he's actually not taken a daguerreotype of the street view, but he's shot into a mirror which is beside his lens, and he's taken a picture of the mirrored reflection of the street view, because a daguerreotype is a mirror reversal naturally. And so he's shooting for a Tasmanian audience who are used to seeing certain buildings on the left side of the street and others on the right side of the street. So to just shoot it as a daguerreotype would have inverted the street, and everything that was on the left would now appear on the right and be very higgledy-piggledy and counterintuitive. So actually, that kind of research where you pretend that you want to rent a room that you're not really interested in renting was really helpful. That kind of idea of, it speaks to the benefit of going to places that you're researching, because you learn new things. In particular, that it hadn't occurred to us about the mechanics of the exposure and how the picture was taken. But we did, traditional research, sitting in archives with dusty boxes and stuff like that. We weren't kind of, Wild West research all the time.
I think,
and we also worked, and just one other point that I think was really kind of mind-blowing to me, is that we work with so many curators and archivists, including Jan, but people all around the world who have Newlands in their collection. We got friends of ours to transcribe our emails into Spanish, and we spoke to Chilean gallery directors. We really, there is a network behind this book of invested professionals and very generous people who shared their knowledge with us. And I think that's really the only way you can do something that has such a global scope, is we're just two people sitting in sleepy Canberra most of the time. We really needed to reach out to those other sites of Newlands practice and those other people who are engaged in different types of research in order to bring this story together.
Yeah, I mean, I think the collector network is really important. And yeah, sure, Jan's got a great Newland, and there's a great one down in Hobart. But because Newland stamped his stuff, because he was a promoter, and then once you kind of pass the test and you're in those collector networks of, late night emails with, guys who, and then you are able to tap into a larger group. So that slide that we showed, just to give you some indication of what the gallery, how mind-blowing it would have been. Mainly they were Indian daguerreotypes, but most of those came from collectors who were daguerreotype collectors who eventually trusted us. So we realised that there was a 2021 network, which is driven by the market, by personal passions for the artefact, which kind of sits under or above or somewhere the institutional set, and both can really work together as well. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, you're kind of talking about, in some ways, working the edges in terms of research, and how you kind of keep digging and picking at things to find it. and also place-based research, which is so important as well.
And I wish I could have shown you some of our Magic Lantern shows. At the same time, we were putting on Magic Lantern shows. And that, I think, for both of us was really important. And it's not until you actually see those hand-painted glass slides actually dissolve before your eyes, you just go, wow, this is beautiful. Yeah, sure. But it was like with Hobart with the mirrors, actually doing it as well. We've both, I think, found that it doesn't come out for the book much, but it's really important for us as well, I think. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. And I know that shows you've had so far have been quite a bit. Kind of gives you an idea really of what Newland was doing.
Yes.
But, I'm interested also in the fact that, at the same time, you have people like Lint and others taking photographs of Aboriginal Australians. Did Newland venture into that, or was he avoided, and if so, why?
Yeah. Well, no, he didn't. And we had to address that in the book. It's an absolute absence in his gallery. Lent was 30 years later, but there were daguerreotypists who were making images of Aboriginal Australians. A guy called Kilburn in Melbourne, but he had a brother in London who had contacts with the Illustrated London News, so there was a wood engraving trajectory for that. A daguerreotypist called Brown in Hobart made images of Aboriginal people as daguerreotype, and a daguerreotypist in Adelaide called Hall even exhibited them. So Newland must have made the decision that it wasn't worth it from his point of view. And I think so, because there was a racial hierarchy. White colonists had a racial hierarchy, and as we've explained with Queen Pomare, she'd been involved in a war with the French, she'd been in the paper, and there was a big interest in Indigenous New Zealanders, Maoris, because of the noble savage bit. So I think that from Newland's point of view, from the way that he calculated what his audience wanted to see, Indigenous people belong to the past, all that racist stuff. And obviously he thought it wasn't worth the investment in the copper plate and the silver plate. So that tells us a lot about the visual economy of Australia during that period, I think.
Sure. And you bring up Pomare, and I'm just wondering, you wrote a fantastic article in The Conversation about your discovery of the Pomare.
No, it's a different. Lisa will explain. Lisa will explain.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because the reception of that article was really interesting for a start, but it kind of highlighted the ways in which the media can be an avenue, as Newland used the media, to promote your research. But can you tell us a bit about how you found it?
Oh, okay. So there's two Pomares in our book, which should say that's very confusing. I know there's Queen Pomare in Tahiti, whose daguerreotype was made by Newland, and is now lost along with the rest of the Daguerrean Gallery. And what we do, because we don't have any Newland daguerreotypes from the Pacific at all, we found a contemporary daguerreotype at the National Library of Australia of a Maori youth called Hemi Pomara.
1846.
From 1846, yeah. And we thought, we really did stumble upon this. I mean, we both live in Canberra, so the National Library is about 1.5 kilometres from our office, and we both spend time there. And because we didn't have a Daguerrean gallery to illustrate our description of, we were looking for kind of contemporary examples of surviving daguerreotypes. So that's how we stumbled on this image. But as we started to research it, we realized it was really significant. And the article that Donna is talking about is an article we wrote for The Conversation about this daguerreotype of Hemi Pomara, who was a young man, and it was taken in London by a very famous daguerreotypist called Antoine Claudette. And we wrote an article in The Conversation to draw people's attention to the fact that even though it's of a New Zealand subject taken in a London studio, the daguerreotype is actually in the National Library of Australia, and how it ends up there is still a bit vague, but it's probably bought from London in the 1970s. And I guess we kind of wanted to draw people's attention to it because the famous New Zealand film director, thank you, had decided to make a movie on Hemi Pomare, but no one except Martyn and I knew that his picture was in the National Library of Australia. So we kind of felt a bit obligated to tell people. But I guess it's the interesting thing about translating your research in the public space, and that kind of was emphasized to us because we weren't Hemi Pomare's biographers. We are photo historians, and we wanted to draw people's attention to the fact that this was a very significant image, and we date it as the oldest surviving portrait of an Indigenous New Zealander taken in 1846. And of course, with the context of the film, we thought it was significant that people knew where it was and who it was of and who took it, and that detective work we did. But it's interesting when I guess there was a generally very positive reaction from Hemi's iwi in New Zealand, his larger family group, but there were a few people who were a bit confused about what our motivations were. Were we biographers of Hemi? And that's kind of that vague space of media translation that we had to keep on coming back to and say that, you know, Indigenous stories and First Nation stories aren't really ours to tell. This is a story that's being taken up by someone who has a lot more authority to tell the biographical story. But the story that we wanted to tell was that this is a very significant image, and it has this amazing trajectory that follows Hemi's life as he travels to London and to this very famous photography studio. Yeah. So, yeah.
I know we don't have to finish, but the image had already been known. So Gail Newton had put the image in her 1988 exhibition. So all we did was identify who it was of and who photographed it. So it had already been exhibited. And that's important too.
But it does show the power of the image, doesn't it?
In terms
of,
and it's a beautiful
telling
image.
Multiple stories, and it's
fantastic. And what was actually really interesting was just how quickly that story travelled and how hungry the media is for things like oldest and first. This was really eye-opening to me as an early career researcher, that within 24 hours of it being published in Australia, we were in the Smithsonian magazine, the National Geographic. It was translated into Polish, French, German. It just exploded. And I thought, wow, this is such a kind of severe juxtaposition between the slow time of the 19th century, when the networks that we talk about, things travel by steam and mail over kind of many days and months, and the internet of the 21st century, which is instantaneous and automatic almost.
Some things change and some things don't.
Exactly.
Really fantastic story. Thank you. And it's amazing to hear both of you talk about Newland and to relate it to Jan's exhibition downstairs, and I'm sure people will be hungry for more information. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.